All right, welcome back. This is the Something Ventured podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am your host, and this week I'm going to do something a little bit different, and that is take a look back at 2017 in Silicon Valley and the topic of sexual harassment. 2017 was quite a year, or something of a year, or a year that we may look back upon and say, hey, did something change in that year? If you listen to this podcast regularly, you know that we've featured a series of conversations about women in Silicon Valley, often with me playing the fool who says, well, it's bad, but it's not that bad, is it? And the response is invariably, oh, yes, it is. And so I've actually gone and done a little bit of research, unlike the usual podcasts in which I shoot for the hip. No, just kidding, hours of preparation. I went back and looked at 2017 and 8 different men who lost their jobs, essentially, over sexual harassment. And we come into this environment where Harvey Weinstein in Hollywood has lost his career. Matt Lauer's career is over. Charlie Rose, a series of people. And that wave landed on the shores of Silicon Valley in 2017. And so I thought somebody, and it looks like it's going to be me, should put on the record a list of sort of what went on in 2017. And I'm sure this is a very incomplete list. But this is what was in the news, and I thought I'd put them all together in one place. So 8 brief stories of men who lost their jobs over different issues of sexual harassment, and we'll talk about the different forms that these terminations take. And then at the very end, 2 clowns, 2 guys whose behavior was so ridiculous that in addition to being horrible and inappropriate, although these 2 guys didn't directly, be very careful about that, directly hurt anybody, they were such idiots that I'm gonna have to tell you their stories too. So like I say, 2017, something maybe changed. We hope it changed. We'll find out. But I want to make the case that perhaps this story of women coming forward and there actually being consequences, that this goes back to a woman named Ellen Pao. And her story, which this chapter of it begins in 2012. Now, as I take you on this journey, I'm not a journalist. I'm just a guy who has access to the internet. So I'll probably get a few facts wrong. And my purpose isn't really to disparage or litigate any particular activity here. So if I get a fact or 2 wrong, if I go a little overboard on how bad the acts were, or don't quite get it intense enough, please forgive me. Please don't take me to podcast court. I think what I'm telling you is directionally right. So we go back and start this story in 2012, well before 2017, with a woman named Ellen Pao. Ellen Pao is a ridiculously accomplished person. She has a degree, and again, I may get this wrong, in engineering from Princeton. She goes to Harvard Law School. She continues on to work at one of the most prestigious law firms, Cravath in New York. And she ends up coming to Silicon Valley and working for a firm by the name of Kleiner Perkins, Caulfield and Byers, KP or Kleiner as it's usually called more commonly. Now, to understand the importance of this story from the perspective of 2012, not the perspective of 2018 looking back, you need to understand that Kleiner Perkins is considered, at this time, 2012, one of the most prestigious firms in one of the most prestigious industries in the world. Among venture capital firms, it's immensely respected for having invested early in companies, hundreds of them, but among them Amazon and Google. And at this immensely respected firm, which at the time would sort of strike fear and awe into the minds of entrepreneurs, at this firm, there's a guy named John Doerr who's the alpha dog of Kleiner Perkins. He this pinnacle firm is the pinnacle guy, and Ellen Pao gets a job working for him. It's a special assistant role. This is kind of a weird rich person role, but it's a thing where you're sort of a bit of a glorified assistant. You trail the person around through their day-to-day activities, so you end up meeting a lot of important people, and you get paid something like $400,000 a year. So here's Ellen, an amazingly accomplished person, at the highest profile firm, arguably in Silicon Valley, working for the highest profile guy there in the highest profile job, a special assistant to John Doerr, technical assistant. Now, as an amusing aside, I will read you the Wikipedia description of that job. It's a job that required degrees in engineering, law, business experience, and experience in enterprise software. By the way, there's no job like that. That's a fake news from Wikipedia. So anyway, Ellen Pao comes into this job, amazingly accomplished person, amazingly accomplished job. And several years later, in 2012, she files a lawsuit. Now, the details of the lawsuit, you can look them up online. One was that there was sexual harassment actually conducted against her. Another was that she had a romantic relation with somebody, broke it off, and then was retaliated against. And the overall scope of the lawsuit, the overall idea of the lawsuit is that she was accomplished, should have been promoted. Men were promoted who had skills similar to hers. But because she was a woman, and in particular because of the different relationships she had, she was retaliated against and therefore prevented from advancing in her career. Now, I need to pause here for a second and say this is horrible. But as you dig into this, any of the numbers or ideas here are ridiculous. She was getting paid something like $400,000 a year, being denied a job that maybe paid something like $800,000 a year. So this is all Mount Olympus stuff that none of us have anything to do with. If you read the lawsuit, you would be forgiven if you thought that it all sounded a little bit silly. Arguments about who met a certain deal first and who got to sit on the board of directors and who didn't get to sit on the board of directors. But all of that is really beside the point. The simple thing that happened here, I believe, is that it was unheard of before 2012 that you would ever strike at a firm as powerful and of such a high reputation as Kleiner Perkins, that it would be such a career-limiting move. It would be such a bad idea that no matter how horrible it was, you would never do it. And in the end, they would win. Well, spoiler alert, in the end, 2015, they did win. Her lawsuit was dismissed. The lawsuit was dismissed. She did not win. However, she's since done fine, going on to be the CEO of Reddit. She's now has a very prestigious job. I can't exactly recall what it is. I believe she's at Kapor Capital, but she's done fine. However, I think at this moment, at this time in history, a lot of hearts and a lot of minds looked at that and said, you know what? You can actually fight back. And you may not win. It still might be unfair. But I think a lot of hearts and minds looked at that and said, you can do that. And I argue that 2017, a whole bunch of things happened. The Me Too movement, other famous people, especially in Hollywood, having their careers ended. But I think you need to look back to Ellen Pao and what she did to understand a little bit about the groundwork that led to the events that we're going to now cover in 2017. By the way, here's a little fun thing about Ellen Pao. Go look up her personal life. Nothing bad about it at all. It's very much not what you would expect. For example, imagine where, venture capitalist working in Silicon Valley, where does she live? Like, were you imagining the Dakota, the big, the place where John Lennon lived in New York? Well, that's where she lives. Anyway, it's a fun little sidebar. So with that said, and with the nod to Ellen Pao laying the groundwork, let's move into 2017 and 8 different events that, if they didn't shake Silicon Valley, made it sit up and pay attention. All right, 2017, let's look at sexual harassment in Silicon Valley. As I've said on this podcast, I regularly have people on, women on, to talk about different issues. I say, I know it's bad, but it can't be that bad. The answer invariably comes back, and this has really woken me up, that it is. No, it's as bad as you think, and it's worse. And I think if you're a certain kind of a guy in Silicon Valley who is not harassed and isn't committing harassment, it's not that you don't think it happens. It's that you maybe don't have the deep sense of how widely pervasive it is. Now, I'll tell you a couple theories, and my friends, I'm just here to report what I hear in Silicon Valley. A couple theories about the events of 2017, and I'll tell you the ridiculous one and the more logical one. The one that I tend to subscribe to is, hey, this is good. People can no longer get away with this. Silicon Valley has a severe problem, imbalance of men and women in different roles, and ending the culture where you can sexually harass people is a very important part of it. Now, there's a countervailing, I would say somewhat ridiculous and cynical theory, but this may be true, idea that there are a lot of men in Silicon Valley who take the opposite point of view, that there's a negative impact of people coming forward, and that is that there's a certain group of men who then say, well, I will no longer go out to drinks with women. I'm going to make sure I meet in the office every day with another person there. Now, I would call that the Hunter Pence approach to business, and obviously it's ridiculous because the conclusion of that argument is don't come forward when these things happen, and of course that's absolutely wrong. You'll also note as we go along here that there's a couple different flavors of how people exit, or how there's a difference between sexual harassment, creating an environment, and it's interesting. It's like a little bit of a Greek play of how people are reacting to adversity. And that takes us to the first event, February 2017. A woman named Susan Fowler who works at Uber. Susan Fowler is a 26-year-old woman who is a site reliability engineer at Uber. And she, this one, as I read it, it's insane what I'm about to say, but this is how it's reported. It is reported, and she says, and we believe her, that she's working at Uber, and her boss starts sexually harassing her, specifically sending her text messages, telling her that he's in an open relationship, and he wants to have sex with her. Now, for starters, really, there's some Uber engineer who's in some open relationship with his wife, and then he's texting, like what the hell kind of creepy crap is that? Anyway, so this goes on, and she takes screenshots of the text messages, takes these to HR. I can't even say it out loud because I can't believe it, part 2, the HR people say to her, this guy is a high performer. We can't do anything about this. We are not comfortable addressing it. You need to find another team. Now, that by itself is stunning. If that HR person hasn't been fired, I can't imagine. I've never worked at a company where if you took something like that to HR, they wouldn't immediately shut down every person involved until the lawyers got in and everything got taken care of. This is a fairly shocking turn of events. Also, I've used the Uber app. Really? There's some guy at Uber who's a high performer? I'm skeptical that there's any engineer at Uber. It ain't that hard. There's plenty of engineers who want to work at Uber. I find it hard to believe that any particular engineer is that valuable. Now, there's a second part of this, which I know my friends who are listening, who are trying to learn about Silicon Valley, you will think it's ridiculous. And yes, Silicon Valley is ridiculous. But they're ordering leather jackets at Uber. Of course they're ordering leather jackets. All companies order leather jackets for their employees. And for some reason, they decide they can only order men's leather jackets. And Susan Fowler and some other women say, hey, why don't you order some women's leather jackets? It won't cost very much, ha ha ha, because there aren't that many women. And they said no. So aside from the fact that this is a story about leather jackets, this is also ridiculous. Susan Fowler eventually leaves Uber. But this sets the ball rolling. Uber's CEO is a hard-charging guy named Travis Kalanick, and he is he leaves Uber as a result of this and a series of other things. I forget how much later, a few months later. Now, before you feel sorry for Travis, he leaves Uber with several $1 billion to his name. And this is sort of the first way people exit. So if you look at what's going on, probably Travis Kalanick was not dismissed from Uber because of Susan Fowler. He was accused of creating a culture that allowed these things to happen. Now, that is horrible. That is not okay. But that is also not the same as sexually harassing somebody, which is something he was never accused of. But isn't that impressive that the board of directors kind of got together and said, wow, we can't allow this culture to continue. We need to get rid of Travis. Well, that's probably not the story. The story of Uber is this, that the board of directors of Uber included its venture capitalists who were tens of billions of dollars to the good. Were standing to profit for tens of billions of dollars if the company went public, and they were quite concerned that Travis, their CEO, was not the guy to take them public. So they were looking to move him out. Folks, if I've told you before that Silicon Valley is a Game of Thrones sometimes, well, there you go. And so using this particular lever, Travis is pushed out of the company. So you decide whether it's the board of directors doing the right thing or whether it is a terrible story being used for a political or ultimately financial purpose. So Susan Fowler is also doing fine. She's an engineer somewhere else now. And by the way, there's another guy in this story, but he's one of the two clowns I'll tell you about at the end of this podcast. He's a member of their board of directors named David Bonderman. He's no longer there. I'll explain who he is and why at the end. Okay, moving on, we come to Binary Capital. We are now in June of 2017. Binary Capital is a very successful younger firm, still hundreds of millions of dollars under management. A couple guys, Jonathan Teo and Justin Callbeck, run it. Incredibly successful firm. They're raising a third fund, I think, of a couple $100 million. When allegations come out, they're reported, I believe, by a publication called The Information, against one of their two partners, Jonathan Teo. The accusations are that he made sexual advances on women who were seeking capital from his firm. Now, this is particularly all forms of sexual harassment are bad. Obviously, the ones in which there are a power relationship are extra bad, meaning he was the gatekeeper to their careers, or part of their careers, in the sense that he could decide to give them or not give them capital depending on how they treated him. Thing number one that's amazing about this, and this is where you look back to Ellen Pao and you look back to Sarah Fowler and go, did they make this possible? As The Information reports this story, 3 women say, yes, you can use my actual name, which is not something we've really seen before. It takes a hell of a lot of bravery to do it, and they did it. Now, in the style of a classic Greek hero, here's what goes down next. Justin Callbeck, not like you know who either of these two guys are, so it doesn't really matter, but Justin vehemently denies it. These women are lying. They are dirtying my reputation. I've always had a great relationship with female founders. Stage 1. The fact that 3 women using their names, and by the way, that is not to say that an anonymous woman not using her name isn't also telling the truth, but the fact that these 3 women came out were quite credible. Did not look great for him. He then switches gears and offers an apology. Now, in the apology phase, Justin does a couple of things. One of them is he writes handwritten notes, all of a sudden going all old-timey, to the women who he harassed. He goes through this is the darkest time of my life, soul searching, etc. And he's going to come back and he's going to be a warning to people about the bro culture in Silicon Valley. Well, my friend, there might be a bro culture problem in Silicon Valley. There may not, but sexually harassing women, in particular, is wrong. And here's the amazing thing that happens: the firm is essentially shut down, and we won't go into the details of how it gets shut down. But a venture firm has something called limited partners. Limited partners are big pools of capital, things like pension funds, endowments, and very wealthy families who put money into the fund, and they generally don't want their name to be in the press. They're very, very rich. They are investing in venture capital as part of a portfolio strategy, and they do not really appreciate drama. And here comes one of the most horrible and dramatic things that can happen. Binary Capital is shut down. And this is an astonishing thing. We talk about people losing their careers. Now we're at a point where an entire venture firm, hundreds of millions of dollars under management, ceases to exist. And in this narrative, we see an archetype, one of several archetypes that we'll see played over and over again. First, there's denial, which nobody believes. Second, there's an apology, which some people believe. Here's the thing about this. We can all look at an apology or I done wrong, I need to get right with this, and decide what we think about redemption and second acts and things like that. But the bad thing, the thing you can't recover from, is that when you say, that woman who's accusing me is lying when she's not, that's the piece where you've done wrong. And for this observer is a pretty tough one to overcome. That's the story of Binary Capital. Once it existed, now it doesn't. Binary, ones and zeros, that one is a zero. We move on now to 500 startups. 500 startups. Now, An article comes out in the New York Times about July or the end of June of 2017, where a woman named Sarah Kunst, again, bravely putting her name out there, accuses the founder of 500 Startups, a guy named Dave McClure, of sexual harassment, and specifically gives the quote that he was interviewing her for a position there and said, "I don't know whether I should hire you or hit on you." End quote. That's an obvious in addition to sexual harassment, abuse of a power relationship. So I'll tell you what happens next, but Dave McClure is a very associated with 500 Startups. 500 Startups is sort of the Dave McClure show, and he's a very famous, well-known venture capitalist, very interesting guy, very much a personality. 500 Startups is characterized by a couple of things. One is that they do many, many investments. All venture firms do a lot of investments to diversify. 500 Startups does a lot more than the average firm. And they're also very international. Their theory being that every great company is not going to be started in Silicon Valley, so they invest in Singapore and Tel Aviv and so on and so forth, all over the planet, Mexico, etc. Dave McClure skips the denial part, to his credit, and goes straight to writing an article called I'm a Creep, in which he explains his behavior, explains that he has, in the 3 months before this, stepped down as the CEO or the head of this company, and indicates that Christine Tsai, I believe I'm saying that, I hope I'm saying that right, is going to take over as the CEO. And that's it. Dave McClure is now, this is stunning in the sense 500 Startups is not gone. In fact, it goes on for a while, and then eventually a Saudi organization buys part of the company. But this is stunning in that the guy, he's not the namesake of the firm, but he is the firm. He's the face of the franchise, is gone out of Silicon Valley. Absolute consequences for behavior. Now, a side note here, and it doesn't excuse anything, but we do know that 500 Startups actually had a lot of diversity. It's a relative term here in Silicon Valley, but in terms of employing and advancing women's and minority in their organizations. In that organization, of course, it doesn't excuse it. Here we are in July, and one of the more famous venture capitalists in Silicon Valley is gone, out from the firm that he created. We now come to the end of July and the story of Ignition and Frank Artali. Now, this is a bit of a more surgical one, maybe of a firm doing the right thing. In July, Ignition, a venture capital firm, I think it's people from Microsoft who did it. They've been around forever, very well respected, very successful. Make an announcement. Frank Artali, a managing director, there have been allegations. We investigated those allegations. We believe they're correct. We have asked him to resign from the firm. He's gone. Now think about this for a second. Would this have happened were it not for Susan Fowler, Ellen Pao, the women who came forward to the information about binary capital? We don't know. But you start thinking that maybe something has changed. Maybe something has changed. And when there are actions, there are consequences. Now, let me, as I think I have on every story here, give you a little counterpoint. These guys who are leaving Ignition, I'm not sure how long he was there, but if you're at a venture firm for 10 years, you are a very wealthy person. You've probably made millions of dollars a year, if not hundreds of thousands, for years and years and years. So a lot of these are people who are possibly at the end of their career anyway, not because they're too old, just because they're too rich. But in any case, Ignition, quickly and quietly, allegations, we agree with the allegations, we investigated them, they are true. We've asked somebody to resign, their career's over. We turn now to Greylock. Greylock, you can argue about who the top venture firms are in Silicon Valley. Usually Sequoia is on that list, usually Benchmark's on that list. Sometimes Kleiner Perkins is on that list, sometimes Andreessen Horowitz is on that list. Greylock is quite often on that list. I won't bury the lead on this one. This is what was reported in Silicon Beat, August 3rd, 2017. The article begins, another Silicon Valley venture capitalist is out of a job over allegations that he engaged in inappropriate behavior. What happened was the chief operating officer of the firm Greylock had been accused of something. Greylock investigated it. The first thing you hear from Greylock is this, that he has been asked to resign. Are we seeing a pattern now? Pretty quickly, we're skipping the denial phase with Dave McClure. We, went straight to the apology phase, and now we're even skipping that phase, and people are just losing their jobs. How does this happen with Greylock? Well, there's something I forgot to tell you. Reid Hoffman, the very famous founder of LinkedIn, among many other things, is a partner at Greylock. And after the event at Binary Capital, he wrote a very impassioned article about the human rights of women entrepreneurs. I think he's had some decency pledge that's gone around Silicon Valley. Although I got to say, if you got to sign a decency pledge, you got bigger problems. So Reid Hoffman, this very important partner at this firm, has written this very impassioned article. Obviously, feels very impassioned about the human rights, as he puts it, of women entrepreneurs. And obviously, Greylock couldn't be in any position other than being on the right side of the issue and the right side of history. So there's the story of Greylock. Quick, simple. All right, no need to linger. It's summer's over. We're now up to October 17th of 2017. We turn now to Amazon. Yeah, that's right. You forgot this one. Amazon owns Amazon Studios. The head of Amazon Studios, now this, if you know what they do, this is pretty significant, resigned over sexual harassment charges. There's a show called A Man in the High Castle. One of the producers is a woman named Isa Hackett. She accuses him of sexual harassment. Amazon investigates. It's true. Their CEO resigns. A simple tale. No need to linger. We turn now in October to the story of Robert Scoble. Who's Robert Scoble? How do I explain this to people who aren't in Silicon Valley? I don't know. He's this guy. Like, you get these guys in Silicon Valley who are just famous for being famous. Like, I don't know what they did. I'm not going to go look up what they did. I don't care what they did. They're just fame balls for being famous. So good for them. Robert Scoble's one of them. Yay. Like, he's got a podcast. Okay, I can tell you that's not that hard to do. He was at some augmented mixed reality company, something like that. But aside from my sarcasm, a very famous guy in Silicon Valley, allegations start coming out, and he apologizes. Great, right? Well, hold on. So first of all, he writes a 2,500 word. You write a 2,500 word anything, you're halfway to being the Unabomber writing a manifesto. But he writes a 25 word apology. Well, you tell me. It's let's see. The title was "No, comma, of that I'm innocent." I will spare you reading this thing, 2,500 words. It's tortured. It blames the women for, I can't even articulate what it is, going after him for some reason. So for some reason, a group of women woke up one day and said, there's not much going on in our lives. I think what we need to do is we need to bring down that Robert Scoble. That podcast has gotten too out of control. And it even includes, not to be sexist here, but one of the women sexually or physically assaults him. The whole thing is, you know what? Go read it. It kind of meanders out at the end with some vague concept of I'm trying to create a dialogue here. It's like, we're having a dialogue here. No of this I'm innocent, I would say, is a canonical example of what not to do if you're accused of sexual harassment. Now, in November of 2017, the curious case of Steve Jurvetson, Draper Fisher Jurvetson, very well-respected firm, very well-respected venture capitalist, SpaceX and Tesla among his investments. This one's very peculiar. Steve is accused of something, and this being a podcast, not the New York Times, I will probably get this wrong, but it seems to be sort of bad behavior, partying, having affairs with married women. He's divorced, not that matters, but stuff among consenting adults, like no apparent complaints about abuse of power or even sexual harassment, just kind of like skeezy behavior, if I may. Anyway, his partners spend a weekend trying to decide his fate, and it comes out that he's going to be kicked out of the firm. As you read the subtext here, and I'm just speculating, and what the heck is the point of having a podcast if you can't speculate? It sounds like we're back to another Game of Thrones thing here, that if his partners had wanted him around, they would have circled the wagons and said, look, this is consenting adults doing things. Maybe it's not appropriate, but this is not an abuse of his relationship to female entrepreneurs. or executives at our firm or anything like that. They could have done that in this particular case. Because, like I say, the dating appropriately or inappropriately is got nothing to do with doesn't rise to it's not related to the sexual harassment issues we've seen in these other firms. So he leaves the firm, is pushed out, I will argue. Now, what do you think Steve Jurvetson's doing now? He's starting his own fund. So we don't know what happened there. A little bit of a high school dramatics. Not sure why I switched away from the perfectly good Game of Thrones analogy, but Steve Jurvetson outed his firm. Not super clear what it is that he did, but still rich as hell and starting a new firm. And now, as 2017 comes to a close, we move to Shervin Persevar of Sherpa Capital. Can't get more famous than this guy or more successful. Airbnb, Uber, to name a few. Multiple women come forward, sexual misconduct charges. He goes a hybrid of the routes that we've discussed thus far. He resigns from Sherpa Capital, which is insane. This is back to that 500 startups model I told you, where he is Sherpa Capital. He's the name and the fame behind it. Denies the allegations, resigns, but denies the allegations, and is going to vigorously fight those who have wronged him. Like OJ, the manhunt continues. So there, 2017 starts to come to a close. I will back up to one thing. The DFJ, in the future, if we're here in 2017, out will come a book about bro culture in Silicon Valley, in which it is claimed that Steve Jurvetson hosted a sex and drugs party at his house. And in fact, if you read this book, you get the sense that Silicon Valley is a mishmash of people who are constantly microdosing on LSD and having sex and drug parties all the time. Now, I am here to attest. There are a lot of things that people say about Silicon Valley that are true and horrible. I think the number of sex and drug parties in Silicon Valley is highly, highly overreported. Many people who were at this alleged sex and drug party said, I don't know, I was there. It was pretty tedious. Most of the parties I go to in Silicon Valley look something like this. It's a bunch of white dudes, which is, not something that we're super proud of, talking about topics that would probably bore to death most humans on the planet. And to the extent there's sex and drugs, sure, that happens at parties, but it's not like we're walking up to doors going, Fidelio, let me in. So, by the way, it's all very dramatic. There is one very big sex and drugs party that everybody in Silicon Valley goes to every year. It's called Burning Man. It's held at Black Rock Desert every year around September. In any case, that takes us through 2017. Obviously, this story will go on long into the future, but it seems like something shifted maybe. People lost jobs, actually lost jobs. Heads of firms that were things that they had built disappeared. Entire firms disappeared. It became not uncommon for an announcement to come out that someone has been accused of sexual harassment, and the phase of denial and apology just disappeared, and the person just disappeared. Well, I promised I'd finish up with two clowns, and here's clown number one, a guy named David Bonderman. David Bonderman was on the board of Uber. He is one of the most successful human beings on the planet. He runs TPG, Texas Pacific Group. He's incredibly wealthy. That's a huge hedge fund. I have friends who have worked at Texas Pacific Group. They say that the daily briefing they get about what's going on around the planet, violence in China, political turmoil in Turkey, interest rates in Africa, is beyond what even the president of the United States gets. So he's on the board of Uber, and so is Arianna Huffington. And as Uber is going through its accusations of being a place that is a hostile work environment for women, the board, including him, get together for several days to study these issues and what can Uber do better to promote, advance women, make them feel comfortable. The board is gathered. Now, even if you're really cynical, this whole exercise is you think this whole exercise is just to make it look like you're doing something, even though you don't give a damn. He participates for multiple days in talking about how to treat women better. Arianna and David Bonderman then go to address the company, tell them about their findings. And David Bonderman opens his mouth, and, Arianna Huffington lays out, hey, we need to be in a place where we have more women board members, because more women board members, more women executives, so forth and so on. David Bonderman decides, this smart man opens up his mouth. He decides he's going to start his stand-up career right here and now. And David Bonderman says, in front of all of Uber, traumatized by these issues with women, in the press every day, the board has just spent multiple days talking about the issue. He says, the only thing that happens, and I'm quoting, when you have more women at a board meeting is that there's more talking. Gah, David Bonderman. What a fool. So first of all, insane. Second of all, board meetings are only talking. It's literally not possible to have more talking at a board meeting. It's not like there's a meditation portion where nobody's talking, a part where you're watching a movie. It's all just people talking. And it's all kind of nonsense too. So aside from the fact that his judgment there was insane, he's wrong. Now, David Bonderman is an incredibly wealthy man. He subsequently leaves the board. He probably didn't want to be on the board, probably had a good laugh about it on his jet on the way home. Don't feel sorry for David Bonderman. So we'll end with James Damore, the second and best clown in this entire story. James Damore is this guy who's hired by Google as an engineer. And he writes a memo. Now, if we've learned anything from this podcast, it's that manifestos don't really help. Now, he writes one, and here's the thesis. It's so ridiculous, I can barely say it, but I'll say it. He writes this memo internally at Google, and his idea is that Google is not open to a diversity of ideas, because if you've got some stupid, racist, sexist idea, they don't like it. And his sexist idea is that the reason that there's more male engineers than female engineers is something biological. I don't even know what. That's, whenever you start talking about biological differences, we know where that ends up. And therefore, men are actually it's incoherent like all these guys. By the way, the easiest decision the CEO of Google ever made was firing James Damore. They fired him. Here's what's funny about that story. Number one, it's not true. Google itself has looked at the characteristics that make people successful at Google, and they concluded that they were doing a lot of things wrong. For example, they were asking people about their favorite superheroes, a question that, what superhero would you be if you could be? Women weren't very good at answering that question. The reason? They didn't spend a lot of time reading comic books. So not super clear that's a big advantage in coding, having read comic books. But what Google concluded was essentially that I think it was the trust that teams had. The amount that you could trust your team was kind of the biggest factor in how well your team did, arguably a trait that women are as good at as men might be. Also, as an aside, there's a book that just came out called Broadband about the history of women in technology. And while women are very important in technology today, all the way back through the invention of computers, the invention of the internet, early computer gaming, women were very significant, if not dominant, in the field. So, I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining why the idea that women are biologically less better at coding than men is wrong. James Damore is a moron. By the way, I don't think he was a very good engineer himself. I don't think he was like the head of AI, at Stanford. I think he was just some crappy, not that very good engineer who made a name for himself. He's since become a darling of the sort of alt-right, the men's movement. Men are just getting screwed. Those guys. And it's funny, if you ever see him interviewed on TV, he's got this really weird interview style where he's done talking, but doesn't signal that he's done talking. And it drives reporters crazy. But screw that guy. Let's leave him in 2017. So there you are. I've gotten it out. That's kind of what I wanted to say about 2017. Hopefully we're in a brave new world. Okay. For those of you who read books, hopefully we are not in a brave new world. Hopefully something has changed. Certainly something has changed. Now, whether it's changed enough, we don't know for sure. It hasn't. Whether it's changed permanently, I think it has. Sexual harassment in all of its forms is wrong. We've always known that. You and I, my listener, have always known that. But until 2017, I'm not sure it really had consequences. And I think due to people like, earlier on Ellen Pao and more immediately Susan Fowler, I think in 2017, women realized that they could strike at these people who had wronged them. And I'm not going to say there were no ramifications. It was clearly a brave thing for them to do. But their words, their speaking out, their honesty did have implications. People lost jobs, firms disappeared. And if it's not the beginning of a new world in Silicon Valley, maybe it's the beginning of a new conversation. Anyway, that's it. Look back, sexual harassment in 2017. I really appreciate you spending a little bit of time with me. This has been the Something Venture podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. See you next time.